Where are you from?
Well, I'm originally from Alberta, but I've moved out and I've been on Vancouver Island for the past 12 years. So currently, I consider Central Island my home in and around Nanaimo.
Okay. Where's your favorite place in the world?
Oh, Thailand's pretty magical, but I've always had a real affinity for a bench that is overlooking Oyster Bay, which is also referred to like Transfer Beach in Ladysmith, and it sits underneath of this really beautiful arbutus tree overlooking the water. It's always
Excellent.
felt pretty magical.
Excellent. So the interview today, or most of the interviews, are regarding substance use, overdoses, drug poisonings, all that stuff. Have you been touched by a drug poisoning?
I have, yeah, not directly within my own family or me as a person, but through some very close relationships, some people that I love and that I hold dear. Um, One has lost their sibling, actually two that have lost their sibling, and then several friends that I have seen experience that loss. And then, more directly, through my own choosing around meeting with some parents that have reached out to me and had let me know that they had lost a child. And it was one of those scenarios where it just didn't feel right to email them back. It definitely felt right to reach out in person, and upon invitation to meet with them directly, I chose to do that and to sit down and to share in their pain and their processing.
That's tough, definitely. Why do you think people use substances?
I think people use substances for a lot of reasons. Um, I mean, all of the reasons that I come back to are the benefits, the good things that people are getting out of them. And so that could be as simple as connection, and, finding a sense of community even through those connections. I know that I've experienced that in my own right with cannabis. It is easy to strike up a conversation. Oftentimes, people who consume cannabis can spot that in one another and forge a real quick, close connection. I think obviously people do that with alcohol. Um, and I know that there's, experimentation, obviously, just trying to understand like what does it feel like when we ingest a certain substance and how am I going to feel. And that could be because of it being the first time, but it also could be in terms of seeking something new and thinking specifically maybe about psychedelics. So I think it's a lot of reasons. And then when I think about where someone may be in a more regular relationship, and it could lend itself to some of these descriptions that we hear around, and I'm going to air quote here, addiction or dependency or problematic use or misuse. I think about Dr. Gabor Mate, and he reflects that, most of us have experienced trauma and the research supporting that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who's experiencing trauma or has experienced trauma will go on to have an addiction or a dependency. But he's also really unequivocal when he thinks about people who are experiencing addiction and dependency, that at the root of that is pain and trauma.
What could we do as a society, or in terms of like the government or healthcare, what could we do to better treat trauma as a base of where addiction might sprout out of, or even just unhealthy behaviors? Is there anything that you can suggest or that you've seen in other places that would work to kind of deal with that in a better way or make improvements?
Well, I think some of the things that we're seeing now where systems are actively engaging in trauma-informed care and trying to embed those approaches, and actually turning up the microphone on people like Dr. Gabor Mate or Peter Levine or there's many, right, that are excellent contributors to that specific realm and that field. But when you listen to them speak, they've also been at it for a long time. So I think, merely embracing those modalities and those theories and trying to educate people around them within the kind of health and social care community isn't enough. I do believe that we have a responsibility to ensure that people are the right fit for the people that they need to serve. And right now, I think a lot of systems do a better job of preserving the safety of their staff than they do the safety of the people that really need care. I feel there's a real distortion, to be honest, in that, in my mind, and part of this is shaped by early childhood experiences of being around alcohol and drugs, having my own relationship with alcohol and drugs, and kind of hearing other people's thoughts as I'm going through that. But I find it really disturbing, the paradox that the people that need our very best care, that are suffering or that are most marginalized and encountering, a multitude of determinants of health like poverty and racism, and income disparity, and limited access to healthcare. There's so many housing. There's these different issues that we know are so real, and yet still day over day right now in this community and communities all around us, the people that need our very best care get our worst. And that's a real hard pill to swallow.
Very true. We mentioned trauma and violence informed care. For somebody who might not know what that is, do you want to speak on that a little bit, what that is?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know it fulsomely, but I think the things that I'm starting to understand it are these values that are at the heart of it and the key principles. And so how do we create choice for people? How do we allow for collaboration with people? How do we empower people? How do we keep and maintain a sense of safety and trustworthiness? I've been really fortunate with the people that I've worked with, and the people that I consider my mentors and my most treasured colleagues and friends, that they've gifted those things to me, and I've been able to witness and watch and with them, in terms of how I work with people, because those values have always been at the heart of it. And even so simply as, I was talking with a friend today around, how do we explain confidentiality of services, and where do we put that at within an interaction, and particularly in one of our first interactions. And we really kind of reveled in like how hard we had to work at something that might seem simple, but it was within those values around going, confidentiality has limits, but when we get up against those limits, what do? That's what makes it special. That's what makes it trauma informed. And so, in those spaces is like reassuring people is like, if I hear something that like I feel is going in that way, that might lead to some kind of disclosure or doing something different with confidentiality, that like you're going to be the first one to know. And I'm not just going to simply tell you, but I'm going to ask you around like, what do you think we should do about it? Or what else do I need to know and understand? And if it does ever get to that point where we needed to share information with someone, it's always going to be done, and preferably is going to be done in that way that respects your dignity, that respects our relationship and your safety, but it's done with care and attention. So when I think about trauma and violence informed care, I think it's those pieces. And for many people that don't know, is like the V in that is this recognition of violence, and recognizing that violence is perpetuated on people through policy. It is perpetuated through capitalism. It is perpetuated through housing being an asset and a commodity that we don't allow everyone to have access to, similar to healthcare, similar to education. So it is that recognition of like, what do we need to do individually when we're connecting and we're supposed to be working together, but also is like, how do we recognize that a lot of the problems that people are suffering through and trying to work their way through are not their own doing.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that have been systematically inflicted upon them and continue to be systematically inflicted upon them.
Mm-hmm.
Hence the rise of really important movements like Idle No More and Black Lives Matter. You know,
There's a lot of
really
incredible
important.
things happening right now.
Truly.
Speaking on incredible things, is there one or two things that you'd want to speak on that you've seen, either community-wise or in our healthcare system or in the government over this, even just over COVID, that you've seen really making some positive impacts and positive changes on people who might be substance users or marginalized people?
I think there's attempts. I think there are some good attempts, and I think they're rooted in some science and listening to people who have that lived and living experience. I'll use this idea around pandemic prescribing, this risk mitigation strategy of trying to provide an alternative to this contaminated drug supply that's harming so many people. And yet, while that is well intentioned and I think could serve people in a really positive way, it can't be done without the right type of financial investment. And the right type of endorsements and kind of policy and guideline work that need to accompany those things. Because while you put one thing forward, we still have doctors and other practitioners reeling from the fear that came at the beginning of the drug poisoning crisis, where there was real risk of punitive actions for overprescribing or for prescribing in ways that led to harms. And so, I think there's a lot of good things, but I think, a lot of the good things are happening on an individual level, and not necessarily on big scale organizational level.
Thank you for speaking on that too, of some of the punitive system that not only patients are dealing with, but also people working in the medical industry. And I think that's something that a lot of, I didn't understand prior to becoming a peer worker, was just what some of those forces that be are holding people back. The changes seem so simple to us, but until we remove those sort of consequences, and is removing the consequences the right actions? Because I know a lot of people believe that they're there for patient safety, but if it also causes more harm, at what point do we change it, and how?
Well, I think it comes down to balance, and that's why I don't believe it can be just about writing a policy, that you actually need to put your money where your mouth is. And so if we look at, COVID as an example, how our government is going to go, 300 and some billion dollars in debt federally, and yet this issue around a contaminated drug supply and drug poisonings has been playing out across Canada and has taken, tens of thousands of people, and yet it hasn't been met with that same level of financial endorsement, and that really limits what is possible. And I know that that's impactful for a lot of people. It's been impactful for me. It's come with a lot of moral distress and pressure on myself, and I see that within my colleagues across all sorts of different organizations. And I think about words from this woman, Vicki Reynolds, and I don't know the exact words, but in principle it's this, which is most of us come into healthcare, and she ventures to say, all of us come into health and social care with good intentions and actually a lot of capacity to do really good work, and yet we're met with this idea of self-care, and then we're met with this other accompanying idea that if we don't do that well enough, we're going to burn out, that the work is burning us out. But actually what she says is that most of us are quite capable of handling the stresses that come with the day-to-day and working in people in very difficult, even traumatizing scenarios, where we will come out in a different way and experience moral injury and burnout or harm is when we run up against the limitations of our system. and we can see very clearly that it's failing the people that we're so committed to providing care to. And in my experience, that's really what I've seen among the people that I've worked alongside, is that the capacity to endure really difficult situations that people have experienced and the pain that they come in with. Most of us are capable of doing that. When we get into those limitations and what our systems are not willing to support people around or support us as staff, that's where some of that injury and harm comes.
Absolutely. It's an interesting way of thinking that I think more people are turning towards, that what harms the patient will also harm the worker.
Yeah.
I know you've done some traveling and stuff like that. Have you seen any places that are modeled better than Canada, and would you like to speak on those experiences?
Yeah, so I ran up against some challenge around indoor inhalation and supervised consumption services. And so I saved what little money I kind of had and went into debt, and I went over to Germany, and I started in Frankfurt, and then I went up to Berlin, and after that I went to Copenhagen because they had some what would be kind of considered, and again air quotes, state-of-the-art indoor inhalation facilities, and then over to kind of Amsterdam and then to Portugal. And the thing that I learned there is that no one has it perfect. Whereas Portugal has decriminalized personal possession, and one of the things that really stood out there was they have mobile methadone vans.
Oh, wow.
And they've orchestrated it around a physician, but also a psychologist and some social workers and some nurses. And they found a model that seems to work, so that for folks that either can't make it to a clinic, or maybe have already been fired by that clinic because of some challenges around medication adherence, which is funny in itself.
Weird thing, yeah.
Or they like the kind of anonymity that type of service offers them. They're servicing somewhere around 12 to 1,500 people a day.
Wow.
And they brought the cost down to about $80 per person per month.
While being mobile.
Wow. And so that was really striking, and yet they didn't have naloxone. So they were looking at us and going, wow, but look, in BC you have naloxone, and in BC you have Insight, and now we have these overdose prevention services. And then similarly in Berlin, the man that I met with was wonderful, and he was also just beautifully practical, which is you don't have to have a state-of-the-art venue for people to go and get good care.
Yeah.
You have to have staff that feel supported and feel equipped and positioned to try and meet people in the ways that are most meaningful for them. And it wasn't about this big state-of-the-art facility, and it was very simple and practical. And yet, this man looked at what was going on in Canada, and he gave me the ugliest look of going, what are you guys doing there? What are you doing? And I couldn't validate what we were doing because the harms were speaking for themselves, and they continue to speak for themselves. So really what I walked away from is that harm reduction, for many people, it's universal, it's global. That community is strong around the world, and no one has it perfect. We need to continue to strive forward. We need to continue to look across oceans, across borders. We need to try and consider how we can do it better, whether that's minimally or maximally. There's always opportunity to do things better.
Excellent. Is there anything else you want to speak on or leave us with?
I just love human beings. And I think one of the things that's been most special to me in terms of being in and around healthcare and harm reduction and social care is that when we can put our own stuff aside, when we can lay those judgments to rest or put them in the corner, and meet human beings as human beings, that there's just something inherently beautiful there. And in those spaces, we can let go of this pressure that we have to fix everything for one another. We don't. It sometimes is enough just to be a caring human being in another human being's presence, and just extend those basic values of care and compassion, empathy where we can. But time with one another is just a really incredible currency, and I think it's one that that we need to invest more in.
It's one of the most valuable resources and the most limited. Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.